And thank you, Allison, and good morning to everybody. This is recording, so we are off and going here. And thank you for inviting me, Allison, and I hope everybody had a good weekend. And I'm going to take you back to 1967. We're going to do some cheerful topics like the Newark riots and also dropping acid. The Six-Day War and the Monterey Pop Festival and the hippies in Haight-Ashbury. And I can't say hippies because they really were hippies in 1967. After 1967, they weren't hippies, but I'll explain that in a couple of minutes. But it was a year that Timothy Leary urged you to take drugs. But it was also a year of violence and rioting in Newark, New Jersey. And if anybody wants to talk about that, we can talk about that when I get to the section about Newark, because whenever I am in the Union County area, somewhere outside of Newark, there's always somebody who is in the audience. And when I do this live, they don't even raise their hand. They tell me about their uncle owning a store that was burnt down, or their cousin having a store, and the people in the neighborhood knew who they were, so they left the store untouched. So if you have any stories about those days in 1967, if you were in Newark, and a lot of people didn't really leave Newark or the Newark area. I've noticed that a lot of people I've dealt with over the years moved to Springfield and Livingston and Milburn, and a whole bunch of towns not too far from Newark. They didn't go very far, maybe 10, 15 miles. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band came out in June of 1967. And at the same time, there was the Six-Day War in Israel, between Israel and Arab countries. Jimi Hendrix was live at Monterey, also in the summer of 1967, while in 1967, Ronald Reagan was in his first year as the governor of California. So the question is here, and you can answer it if you want, was the 1967 year the summer of love or the summer of war? Well, the answer is a little of both. It was actually both. There were hippies in San Francisco, but there was a war in Vietnam, and there was a war in the Middle East, and there was a war starting in Nigeria. While the psychologist, Timothy Leary, who you saw on the first slide there, he was at Golden Gate Park in San Francisco, and about 30,000 hippies, although I don't think there were 30,000 hippies, 30,000 people, and I'll explain that to you in a couple minutes. 30,000 people were at Golden Gate Park in San Francisco listening to Leary say, turn on, tune in, and drop out. There was rioting in the streets of Detroit and also in Plainfield, New Jersey. And these people might have been hippies, or they just might have been young people. It's hard to define what a hippie really was because there is no literature saying what a hippie was. There's no ideology, just a bunch of young people who happened to end up in San Francisco during the summer of 1967. And this was taken in November of 2019, actually at a bread museum in the Wharf in San Francisco. They made bread downstairs, and they have a cultural museum upstairs right in the Wharf. And that was the last trip that I was on, at least the West Coast. It's now, what, 14 months ago. What is the Summer of Love? Well, the hippie counterculture movement culminated with the Summer of Love. By the fall of 1967, sayings like feeling groovy gave way to make love, not war, as chants, as the youth protested conflict in Vietnam, staged marches, and had snips on behalf of the civil rights movement. The United States in 1967 offered two narratives that summer. One was firebombs, napalm, jungles, the draft, Vietnam. The other, communes, LSD, flowers and rock music. In San Francisco was the epicenter of both tales, because it would be in San Francisco, actually across the bay in Oakland, about 11 miles away, where soldiers departed going to Vietnam. And there is the U.S. Army Oakland Port of Embarkation That is the last place that a good many people shipped off to Vietnam saw in the United States. Some did. The last time they were on American soil was in San Diego, less so than in Oakland. San Francisco Bay area was often the last place a service member would see before heading off to the war. By 1967, the United States commitment in Vietnam had escalated to 500,000 men and women. I had a woman in New Jersey say to me, you know, you keep saying the boys or men, but you keep forgetting there were women who were in Vietnam, and the women included reporters. Dixie Chappelle was the first journalist who was killed in 1965 in Vietnam. She had been in trouble spots around the world for a long time, including getting arrested in Hungary in the 1956 uprising. So there were men and women in Vietnam, nurses, support staff, etc. 200,000 of those shipped out from the Oakland Army base. The hippie convergence on Haight-Ashbury, again, this is from the Bread Museum in San Francisco. As 70 million baby boomers came of age, many resisted middle-class shackles and advocated free speech, free love, and psychedelic enlightenment. Between 1966 and 1968, the Haight-Ashbury, just called the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood became the scene of the hippie movement and gave rise to San Francisco rock sounds. Artists like Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane, Quicksilver Messenger Service, Janis Joplin, Moby Gray, Country Joe and the Fish, The Great Society, and the Steve Miller Band. 1967 was also, in a couple of weeks, you'll be, well, I don't know if you will be celebrating this. I don't know how many people will be celebrating this because of COVID-19, but the quasi-American holiday called the Super Bowl started on January 15th, 1967 in Los Angeles, a game between the National Football League's Green Bay Packers and the American Football League's Kansas City Chiefs. And there were a lot of empty seats there. 1/3 of the Los Angeles Coliseum was empty. Green Bay would defeat Kansas City 35-10. We were also going through the Cold War and the space race. I was 10 years old at the time. I had no idea that the space race really was connected to the Cold War and that if you dominated space, you were going to win the Cold War. Well, these three guys, Gus Grissom on the left, Edward White in the center, and Roger Chaffee on the right, were supposed to go up in the Apollo 202 spacecraft. And they were supposed to circle the Earth, and the Apollo was the last step that the Americans were going to take in the road to going to the moon, and you have to test out the aircraft and everything else. They were scheduled to go up in February of 1967, but in January of 1967, there was a dress rehearsal for the February 21st space shot, and the three crew members, Grissom, White, and Chaffee, were in the spacecraft going through the last seconds of a simulated flight, and there was a spark, and there was pure oxygen in the nose cone or the command module, and you put a spark together along with a pure oxygen environment, you're going to have trouble. A friend of mine by the name of Dick Hull, H-O-L-L, Dick Hull, worked for NASA between 1960, 61 and the mid-1970s. And he was telling me that getting to the moon was nothing short of a miracle. And that so many corners were cut. And that he said in this case, and he heard the final tape, he told me, of these guys, the last 60 seconds of their life. And he said, you don't want to hear it. It's just horrible listening to it. But he heard it because he was part of the team. And he said that it was a simple mistake. You put pure oxygen in, all you needed was a spark, and you got what you got. And he said it's amazing that more accidents didn't happen because everything was done on the cheap. Everything was cost-cutting and all. Eventually there would be an inquiry, and that's what they said. You know, there was wiring, there was a spark, oxygen, boom, that was it. These guys, the Smothers Brothers. Now, when I'm live, and I do this live, I look at the crowd. And as soon as this picture goes up, I look around and I see smiles on a lot of faces. Going back now 54 years on this one, the Smothers Brothers. Smothers Brothers came to TV because CBS and William Paley's network, CBS, had old viewers. Lucy was on. That skewed old. Red Skelton was on. That skewed old. Ed Sullivan was on. And yeah, it skewed old, but Ed was trying to bring in young people with the Doors and younger acts at that point. And of course, he had Topio Gigio. Kiss me goodnight, Edie. That was the last words ever heard on the Ed Sullivan show, Topio Gigio. To Ed Sullivan, Kiss Me Goodnight, 1971. So they had the old shows, and they had a lot of rural shows, Green Acres, Beverly Hillbillies, and William Paley, his friends on the Upper East Side of Manhattan said, you're the chairman of CBS, how could you have all these shows on, these rural shows on, the Andy Griffith Show. I'm gonna just throw this one out here too, because it's an interesting show in the sense of the premise. Petticoat Junction, which started in 1963, was the first show that a woman was the head of a business and the breadwinner in the show. Kate Bradley, played by Bea Benadette. So anyway, that was 1963. And so he's beginning to look at his schedule. Gunsmoke, Miss Kitty, wasn't Miss Kitty anymore after all of those years. And so he's looking at his schedule, and he's looking at his schedule. And he says, you know what? I got to get younger. Gets these two guys. They had them in 1963. They're about 30, 31 years old at the time. You know, they're pretty well known in the Los Angeles area, and they're a comedy musical team, folk music and all. Hey, let's bring them in because we're going to get a younger audience. And they do. February 5th, the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour debuts. And it's a different show. And it would begin a 3-year battle with Bill Paley over scripts and guests and politics and anti-war skits, and David Steinberg and Lee French as a hippie. And there were some people on that show that I don't know whatever happened to. Maybe you could help me. There was a guy who had an arrow through his head, played the banjo, Steve Martin. No idea what happened to Steve Martin. There was another guy who you never saw on camera, but he was a writer, and he went on to other things. So they tell me that he was on the show, and he played Meathead on All in the Family. His father was the Dick Van Dyke Show guy, Carl Reiner. Oh yeah, I remember his name, Rob Reiner. Whatever happened to him? So these were the people on the show, and Anson Williams and Super Dave Osborne, and they were young, and they were against Vietnam. And it was different, and CBS could not handle it. Meanwhile, on April 4th, 1967, exactly 1 year prior to his death, actually 366 days because 1968 was a leap year, Martin Luther King was at the Riverside Church up in Riverdale. And actually in Upper Manhattan. He wasn't in Riverdale. It's not in Riverdale, Riverside Church. Anyway, but it's in that 2 miles from Riverdale. Anyway, on April 4th, he speaks at the church and he talks about Vietnam. And he gets involved with Vietnam, saying, somehow this madness must cease. Now, King and Lyndon Johnson begin splitting in 1969. They were allies in 64 when the Civil Rights Act was passed, but by 66 they were splitting. And Martin Luther King took the anti-Vietnam War that he was anti-Vietnam War by that point. Meanwhile, if you were in Central Park, where were you in April of 1967, and you had a draft card, and you decided to burn it, which was against United States law, by the way. You could not burn your draft card. You could burn your draft card because there were big, big demonstrations around the country, in every state in the country, that people were demonstrating, whether they were very small demonstrations or large demonstrations, such as Central Park. April 15th at the Sheep Meadow, 60 young men, including some students from Cornell, came together, burnt their draft cards in the Maxwell House coffee can. Why Maxwell House? You never find out why in Maxwell House. No Euban. Could have done in Euban. Could have done in Sanka. You remember Sanka, Juan Valdez? But they decided to burn their draft cards in a Maxwell House coffee can. Meanwhile, this was going around the nation that day. That was San Francisco. And like I said, there were smaller demonstrations throughout the country as well. No negotiations, get out of Vietnam, one of those signs in San Francisco. These are not the hippies yet. These are just everyday people who are protesting. It was called the Spring Moby protest, 300,000 in New York and San Francisco. It was founded in November of 1966, the Spring Mobilization Committee to End the War in Vietnam. Like I said, they had all kinds of demonstrations around the country. Meanwhile, also in April, that guy, Muhammad Ali, heavyweight champion of the world for 3 years at this point, and a scary guy to some because he was a member of the Black Muslims, although he would split with them. The New York Times, by the way, never referred to him as Muhammad Ali. He was Cassius Clay because he never legally changed his name, because in the 1960s, you didn't have to legally change your name. You just declared, this is my new name. And Abe Rosenthal, who was the editor of the New York Times at that point, never referred to him as Muhammad Ali, at least through the early 1970s. Anyway, Muhammad Ali was drafted by the United States military in 1966, called up for induction in 1967. He goes to Houston on April 27th, and he intends the induction, but he refuses to answer his name or take the oath. And there he is. He's been arrested at that point. He faces a 5-year jail term, also a $10,000 fine. Immediately, the sports people react, and they don't react well. The World Boxing Association, without any due process, no due process at all, no hearing, no due process, strips him of his title. The New York State Athletic Commission, no due process. They don't even ask him anything, nothing. They strip him of his boxing license, which means his career is effectively at the end. He did come out and have a news conference afterwards, and he said, why should they ask me to put on a uniform and go 10,000 miles from home and drop bombs and bullets on brown people in Vietnam, while so-called Negro people in Louisville are treated, and that's his hometown, Louisville, are treated like dogs and denied simple human rights. That is me and Ali in 1985. He is convicted in 1969 of draft evasion, faces the 5 years in jail and the $10,000 fine. He would eventually appeal it to the Supreme Court, and he would win. He would win in the Supreme Court on appeal. I'll tell you a story about Ali from my friend, the late Shelley Saltman, who worked for him, starting with the Ali Frazier fight in 1971 until he quit because his friend was getting beaten up in the ring in 1979, and Shelley didn't see any real upside to Ali continuing to fight because he felt he was going to become a punch-drunk tomato can at some point, which he was by this point. He couldn't even speak in 1985. But I'm going to tell you a story. Shelley was a Korean War vet. Although he didn't see any action in Korea, he was with Armed Forces Radio Network. And Shelley told me that Ali hired him. And Shelley said, I told Ali, he said, I'm going to work for you because the money is good, but and I'm going to promote the fight, but I don't like you. I don't like you at all. And Muhammad said to him, let's sit down and let's talk. And for 3 hours, Muhammad talked to him, and Shelley came away believing that he was sincere as a conscientious objector, which is what he filed in 1967. He was extremely, he was dedicated to that, being a conscientious objector. He was sincere. In 1968, a group of athletes in Cleveland called the Cleveland Summit, which included Jim Brown and Lou Alcindor, interviewed him to see if he was sincere. And they said, yes, he was sincere. The other story I'm going to tell you about is one that you probably don't know about. I think it's 74, 75. I forgot what year it was. There was a boxing wrestling thing, and it was in Tokyo, and it was Ali against the wrestler Tony Inoki. And Tony laid on the mat and just kicked Ali and kicked him and kicked him and kicked him for whatever the exhibition lasted. Ali got infections, quick infections from constantly being kicked, because Sanofi didn't have, she's kicking him. And the doc said, you gotta go to the hospital. Ollie said, no. He said, no, you gotta go to the hospital. This is serious. This is really serious. He said, no, I'm not going. So why? He says, I'm going to Korea. I gotta go to South Korea. I made a commitment to the United States military to give exhibitions and clown around with the soldiers. That's what I'm going to do. And he did. And he was sick, and he ended up in the hospital. He was in critical condition for a little while, for a few days. But his doctors told him not to go because he was in bad shape, and yet he felt an obligation to the U.S. military to entertain the troops. That was according to Shelley. So his career effectively would have been over in 1967. He would come back in 1970 through the back door in Georgia, where there was no boxing commission. He'd fight Jerry Quarry. Meanwhile, in Israel, there is the 6-Day War. Not Saudi Arabia, Syria and Egypt against Israel. Back in the mid-1960s, Syria now has the Ba'ath Party behind them, and al-Assad is part of that group that took over in the 60s. And his son is, of course, now leading the civil war in Syria. Anyway, Syria-backed Palestinian guerrillas had begun staging attacks across the Israeli border, and that provoked reprisals from the Israeli Defense Forces. By the way, I just mentioned my friend Shelley. Shelley's cousin, Mati, helped put together the Israeli Defense Forces back in 1948. Just dropping that in there. In 1967, the skirmishes worsened after Israel and Syria fought an air and artillery engagement in which 6 Syrian fighter jets were destroyed. And there is Nasser, the president of Egypt, and he gets involved. In the wake of the April air battle, the Soviet Union provided Egypt with intelligence that Israel was moving troops to its northern border with Syria in preparation for a full-scale invasion. The information was inaccurate, but if you hear people talking over the years like I have about the Soviets and now the Russians, misinformation is a major part of the Russian game. And I've had so many people, whether it's in the sports world with the Olympics or the political world, have told me the same thing, that misinformation is a big deal with Russia. That's what they've told me. Nevertheless, even though it was bad information, Nasser decides, I'm going to get to action, and he does. Remember, at one time, the United Arab Republic was made up of Syria and Egypt. They had an alliance. So he orders the Egyptian forces to advance into the Sinai Peninsula, where they expel United Nations peacekeeping forces, which had been guarding the border since the 1956 Egypt-Israel altercation. They had been there over a decade. And there is one of the UN observers. On May 22nd, NASA banned Israeli shipping from the Straits of Tiran, the sea passage that connects the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aqaba. A week later, there was a defense pact with the king of Jordan, King Hussein, and the Israelis said, don't get involved, you'll be sorry. But he signs the deal. And there's more pictures from the 6-Day War. In the weeks leading up to the war, the Syrians and Egyptian leaders made no secret that they were coming to destroy Israel. Jordan was going to get involved, King Hussein, but Moshe Dayan and the other Israelis said, you probably don't want to get involved in this thing. Why don't you just stay on the sideline? Just stay. Don't worry, we don't need you. On the morning of June 5th, Israel staged a sudden preemptive air assault that destroyed 90% of Egypt's air force on the tarmac. A similar air assault incapacitated the Syrian Air Force. And then it's time for the ground war. Within 3 days, Israel had achieved an overwhelming victory on the ground, capturing the Gaza Strip, which 54 years later remains a problem. All of the Sinai Peninsula, which eventually would go back to Egypt because of the Camp David Peace Accord, to the bank of the Suez Canal. And that is Moshe Dayan, who is the architect of the Israeli victory. Moshe Dayan in 1957, Joe Washburn, who was one of Morrow's boys. I was at a party for the unveiling of Good Night and Good Luck. And Washburn was telling me a story about how in 1957, Morrow, Washburn, his wife Shirley, who also worked for Morrow, and others were in a helicopter with Moshe Dayan. And Moshe turns to Ed. He says, Ed, my friend, stop smoking those cigarettes. They're going to kill you. He said, not going to kill me. He said, no, you shouldn't. They're bad for your health. And within 5 years, Morrow had died of lung cancer caused by cigarettes. Anyway, Israel doubled its size. They conquered Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip, Sinai Peninsula, and the Golan Heights of Syria and the West Bank. And to this day, some of that remains a problem with the Palestinians. Arab leaders in Khartoum, Sudan, meet in August of '67, signed a resolution. No peace, no recognition, no negotiation with Israel. Of course, that would change in the 1970s with Sadat and seeking peace with Israel, with Egypt, his Egypt with Israel. While all this is going on, people are gobbling up this new album by the Beatles called Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Ringo, John, Paul, and George in that picture. In Britain, the album hits #1 immediately and stays there between June of '67 and February of 1968, 27 weeks, top of the chart, and would run almost 3 years on the chart. All of this in spite of a BBC ban on the song, A Day in the Life. The album enjoyed a 15-week stay at the top of the US 200 albums and was on the US charts for almost a year and a half. And it's a patchwork album. Most of the songs don't belong with one another, but it's a theme album. It goes from English hall music to psychedelic music to the band song A Day in the Life. It's an interesting album in just all the styles that were used on that album. And for many, many years, it was considered the top album of all time by rock critics. My top album for the Beatles is Revolver. But yeah, everybody's entitled to personal taste, and Abbey Road and then that. So that's out on the streets. And Monterey, the Monterey International Pop Festival starts. And Jimmy plays Monterey, and the Beach Boys are not there. And Jimmy says, no more of that striped shirt surf music, all gone. Referring to the Beach Boys and the striped shirts they used to wear in concerts and all the surfing music. The Monterey Pop Festival featured nearly 36 well-known and unknown acts representing an eclectic mix of styles and sounds. Otis Redding. Oh, you know what Otis Redding's big song was? See, I'd ask you, if we were all together, I'd ask you and I'd hear, oh, Sitting by the Dock of the Bay. And I'd say, yeah, that was his #1. Yeah, that was his #1. But his real blockbuster song was done by Aretha Franklin. Respect, R-E-S-P-E-C-T, respect. And if you listen to the words, it's written from a man's point of view, and Aretha makes it a woman's song. But that was an Otis Redding song. So next time you think you hear Respect by Aretha Franklin, she just sung it. He wrote it, but she made it her own. And it's a much better version than the original. So Otis Redding, Ravi Shankar, Hugh Masekela all had significant exposure at the Monterey Pop Festival, which is about, or is 90 miles. Monterey is about 90 miles south of San Francisco. Last cruise I was on, which was in November of 2019, we went from San Francisco to Monterey, which is really nice. Monterey is really, really nice. Also, other acts that were there, the Animals, the Association, the Byrds, Jefferson Airplane, and the Mamas and the Papas, but no Beach Boys. Beach Boys were not there. As this is going on, Vietnam continues. Johnson's a war criminal. As you can see, the demonstrations are picking up around the country in 1967. How'd we get there? Well, in the late 1950s, during the Eisenhower administration, Vietnam split into two: North Vietnam, which was communist, South Vietnam. France got out of there in 1954. Cold War anxieties dictated The domino theory. If the North Vietnamese communists prevailed, the rest of Southeast Asia would fall like dominoes. Ironically enough, the Eisenhower administration didn't think Vietnam was the problem. They thought Laos was the problem, and they would fall first. Laos was a problem, but it never really fell like South Vietnam would in the 1970s. When JFK took office in 1961, he vowed never to allow South Vietnam to fall to communism. Gulf Tonkin Resolution, 1964, gave Lyndon Johnson carte blanche. Do whatever you want in South Vietnam, win the war. There were only 5,400 men called up for the draft in January of 1965. 45,000 per month were called by December of 1965. Young people said, hey, this can't be, and started demonstrating in 1965. Joan Baez, who just turned 80 years old, I think 2 days ago, who got off the road now 2 years ago because nobody was on the road in 2020. There she is singing in San Francisco. I think that's Allen Ginsberg behind her. George Harrison would visit San Francisco. Remember, the Beatles are off the road now. They are going their separate ways. And he decides to go out to check out what's going on in Haight-Ashbury. That's Derek Taylor behind him. To his left, who is the Beatles' press secretary. And he's in Haight-Ashbury. Now, there's a woman up in Connecticut, up in Fairfield, Connecticut, who stopped me as she saw the Harrison picture. And I didn't even get too far on it. And she just stopped me and she said, you know, during the day, I was a banker and I was a bank manager in Oakland during the day in 1967. And I visited Haight-Ashbury at night. And I said to her, I said, did you partake in what was going on in Haight-Ashbury? And she says, a woman never tells. I said, I didn't ask your age. She said, a woman never tells. Anyway, I hope to see her again one of these days. I haven't seen her since last February. She's a really cool woman. From those days, and I haven't been at her place to speak in a while. So, but she's come to my talks and she enjoyed them. And I always say, a woman never tells, right? She said, no, she doesn't. Anyway, Haight-Ashbury was a district in San Francisco, a community that young people converged upon based on counterculture ideas. I'm not sure what the counterculture idea is. It's a term that's out there. But what was the counterculture ideals? We don't know. Drugs, we know that was there. Music, we know that was there. The neighborhood, which wasn't very big, offered a gathering spot to create a social experience that would soon spread through the nation. Really didn't. People went to San Francisco, but they left it in San Francisco. The hippie community had easy access to drugs, which was perceived as a community unifier. There was a local group that lived there called the Diggers. The Diggers believed in a free society and the good in human nature. They established a free store, gave out free meals daily, built a free medical clinic, which relied on volunteers and donations. There was a song, a huge song for Scott McKenzie, San Francisco. If you go into San Francisco, be sure to wear some flowers in your hair. That may be out of the question for me now, but when I was 11 years old, it wasn't. Be sure to wear flowers in your hair became a big hit. The Monterey Pop Festival cemented the status of psychedelic music as part of the culture, elevated the local hate bands, such as the Grateful Dead, Big Brother and the Holding Company, Janis Joplin's backup band, and the Jefferson Airplane to stardom. Meanwhile, in San Francisco, the Summer of Love attracted a wide range of people of various ages. Teenagers showed up, college students showed up, drawn by their peers, the allure of joining a cultural utopia. But middle-class vacationers showed up there as well. And some of the people going to Vietnam, on the other side of the bay, there was no BART there at that time, so they had to drive in. There was no mass transit in terms of a train system. So they had to drive in from San Francisco or from Oakland and other military bases within driving distance. They showed up. That is October 6th, 1967. Those are the diggers. That is a casket. And the hippie movement is buried on October 6, 1967. The death of the hippie, the funeral. The Haight-Ashbury area deteriorated, overcrowding, homelessness, hunger, drug problems, crime afflicted the neighborhood. And people decided, okay, we played enough. We got to go back to school and become real professionals. So the college kids left. And so the digger happening, the death of the hippie ceremony. It was a mock funeral. The hippies, done. What was a hippie? We don't really know. There was nothing left behind in terms of ideology, no writings. We got a bunch of pictures, we got a bunch of video, and we got George Harrison talking about his perception of Haight-Ashbury. And there's George along with his wife at the time, Patty Boyd, in 1967. And this is what George Harrison, the Beatles, said. And he was only 24 years old at the time. I went there expecting it to be a brilliant place with groovy gypsy people making works of art and paintings, carvings, and little workshops. But it was filled with horrible, spotty, dropout kids on drugs. It turned me right off the scene. I can only describe it like a Bowery, a lot of bums and dropouts. Many of them very young kids who dropped acid and come from all over America to this LSD, mecca of LSD. George was on LSD and he did drop acid and he did other things. But he's describing it like this. So I go back to the woman in Fairfield, Connecticut, who was there. And I said to her, tell me that description. She said, spot on. She said, I left it too. A lot of other people left it. It was basically a place of derelicts. Hence the funeral for the hippies in October of 1967. The neighborhood really deteriorated. Meanwhile, Ronald Reagan was the governor, about 90, 100 miles away in Sacramento. And he described what he thought the area was. I'm sure he didn't write this because this is too good. A hippie is someone who looks like Tarzan, walks like Jane, and smells like cheetah. Okay, Newark, New Jersey. This is where I open it up. Anybody who had relatives who, you can put it in the chat box, and we can talk about it or we can talk about it afterwards. Anybody who had relatives in either Newark or Plainfield during the riots. Again, when I'm in Union County, whether it's Milburn, Livingston, Springfield, Westfield, West Orange area, the West Orange Library, or or Metro West, the Jewish community centers, as far away as Parsippany, or also in West Orange as well, or even in Scotch Plains in New Jersey, central New Jersey, which I think is closer to you. There are always people who have relatives who tell me, or were there in Newark, in their stores, protecting their stores. And I've had people telling me that their grandfather sat saying, you know me, I've never done anything to you. We've been friends for you. You've been my customers for years and years and years, trying to protect their stores. And I don't know if anybody in this group has that experience, but I've had that experience. And people told me all they wanted to do was protect their businesses. They loved the Newark area, although they had moved out of the Newark area. And there were a lot of Jews who not only moved out of the Newark area and stayed in the area, but also the whole synagogues ended up picking up and moving just outside of Newark. They stayed in the area. They actually loved the area. Here's a picture: withdraw the troops from Newark. Youth against war and fascism. War and fascism. I guess you've heard that lately. Not self-defense or self-defense from police terror. Youth against war and fascism. Free our black brothers. Withdraw the troops. In a couple minutes, I'm going to tell you about the Kerner Commission. And you tell me in a couple of minutes if the Kerner Commission was right or wrong, or have things changed since the Kerner Commission. I'll tell you about that in a minute. The riots, primarily in East Coast, Midwestern cities, Milwaukee, Buffalo, Tampa, Cincinnati. The incidents, more than 100 deaths, hundreds of millions of dollars in property damage, scores of burnt out neighborhoods, some of which have never fully recovered. As in Newark, there are some areas never recovered. 3 years ago, I was in Detroit and I was speaking on a cruise ship, and we were going to the Henry Ford Museum. So we're all on a bus and we're taking this bus to the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn. And you could still see the scars of the 1967 rioting in Detroit, Michigan. Again, another picture of Newark. In fact, one woman said, I knew the Kraftchick families, curtains and linens, and that is the National Guard on the street, making sure that this guy here keeps moving and moving and moving and moving. This is what American streets look like in 1967. This was not atypical. The riots were definitely here. Were they race riots? Were there insurrections or reactions? Historians now are looking back and saying, wait a minute, they may not have been riots. They may have been insurrections, or they just may have been reactions to police brutality back in the day. Or just the fact joblessness, or putting people, weren't being educated, segregation, the Jim Crow laws, etc. So historians are now looking back decades later and trying to figure out what exactly do you call this in Newark or in Plainfield, to name two New Jersey cities, or any other areas. June 27th, race riot in Buffalo, New York, 200 people arrested. July 12th, race riot, Newark, New Jersey. There are casualties here. Now, if you remember in 1967, casualties at dawn. You heard casualties at dawn. You put on the TV, listen to the radio. In the New York area, WINS was on for 2 years at this point as an all-news radio station. WCBS was just starting in 1967. And they'd have casualties at dawn. It would be in Vietnam. 17 Americans dead, 33 wounded. X amount missing in action, the Viet Cong, et cetera, et cetera. So you had a body count in Newark, 26 people dead, 1,500 injured, 1,000 arrested. Race riots, Cairo, Illinois, race riots, Durham, North Carolina, July 17th, July 19th. July 23rd through 27th, 43 people die in a race riot in Detroit, Michigan, 1,000 injured, 442 fires are set. Cambridge, Massachusetts, Maryland, Cambridge, Maryland, July 24th, race riots in Detroit, forcing the postponement of a Detroit Tigers, Baltimore Orioles baseball game. And Willie Horton, who is a star, an African-American star with the Detroit Tigers, tried to calm down the people in Detroit in this particular instance. Another picture, Newark, New Jersey, soul brother, hey, leave me alone. I'm one of you. Just don't wreck my store. I'm one of you, complete with the plyboard on the window. Meanwhile, hey, this guy is trying to be helpful. This guy is down in Louisiana, is offering his services to the Louisiana State Police. Hey, take me. I'll help you out. Please take me. They said, no, we can handle this by ourselves. So what was the unrest? What was the unrest all about? Well, historians, as I said, are wrestling to what call it, but they knew what it was. It was a reaction to a large problem. Deep-seated anger, hopelessness simmering in many disenfranchised communities, urban communities where rates of poverty, joblessness, and crime were disproportionately high. And this guy gets involved. And I'm going to break script here for a second, because see that guy on the right? That guy on the right is John Lindsay. March of 1978, the final Saturday in March of 1978, I'm 21 years old. And Steve North is my news director at WGRC Radio in Nanuet, New York. And he says, I got an assignment for you on Saturday. I said, sure, what do you got? He says, I want you to go to the Democratic fundraiser. Everybody from New York State's going to be there. And just find something, just find whatever. We'll use it on Monday morning, and it worked out great. Well, I go to the Tappan Zee Townhouse, which is now a senior home in Nyack, New York. And in walks, Mario Cuomo walks in with his two kids, Andrew, who's a teenager, and his little kid, Chris, with Matilda. Patrick Moynihan, who's running for Senate, is there. Hugh Carey, who's running for governor, is there. Cuomo was running for lieutenant governor. There was an obscure assemblyman who walked in, who you might have heard of, I don't know, Gerald Nadler, who's now in the House of Representatives. Wow, it's 43 years ago now. And this guy walks in, and he walks right to me, and I had never met him. He'd never met me. He never introduced himself, but I knew who he was because I watched Batman. He was the mayor of Gotham City, John Lindsay, and he just comes up to me and he said, I want to tell you something. I like you. Okay, you know, whatever. And he said, I'm running for Senate, 1980. Hey, great. Tell that to my microphone. He does. I got my scoop. I got my big scoop. So I run back to my 500-watt radio station, file it with UPI and AP, and I get a call from WNEW Radio in New York. 21 years old. Henry Marcotte's on the other end of the phone, and he says, hey, can we buy that audio tape from you, and can you do a donut, which is a report? And I said, sure. How much are you going to pay me? He said, $10. $10 sold. Hey, that was a great price, $10. And with that, I was on WNEW, home of William B. Williams, among others, Julius LaRosa. And it propelled my radio career. And I was with WNEW for 3.5 years. So that's all thanks to that man on the right, John Lindsay. But here's Lyndon Johnson. And he wants to find out why all this rioting. And the guy to his right is Otto Kernan. Otto Kernan is the governor of Illinois. And he is the guy who is putting together this commission, which would include the New York City Mayor, John Lindsay, to find out why Newark blew up, why Plainfield blew up, and others. The Kernan Commission, it was a bipartisan task force. Remember, Lindsay was a Republican in those days, a liberal Republican. Anyway, it was the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, known as the Kernan Commission, named after its chair, the Illinois governor, Otto Kernan. And it asked 3 questions. These were the 3 questions. What happened? Why did it happen? And what could be done to prevent it from happening again? And there's John Lindsay again, as the Kernan Commission is turned in, or the report's turned into Lindsay. And there is, oh, thank you, John. I owe you a lot, John. And you'll never know how much you owe me, or I owe you, rather. Anyway, so there is Lyndon Johnson accepts the Kernan Commission. And this is what they said. This was their recommendation, the blue ribbon panel of politicians on how to solve what was going on in Newark, New Jersey, Plainfield, and other places around the nation. Create 2 million new jobs. Create 6 million new affordable housing units. Revamp the welfare system. Eliminate de facto school segregation. Eliminate abrasive police practices. Establishing redress mechanisms. This is one that I can tell you has not happened since 1967. All you have to do is look at your local news and just see what they do. It's murder, mayhem, entertainment, sports, and weather. And generally, it's perp walks or Crime Stoppers. That's what it is. On weather in the New York area, 2, 4, 5, 7, 9, 11. That's what you got. Anyway, improving news coverage of problems facing Black Americans, making local government more responsive to inner city communities. Johnson accepted it, liked it, to a certain extent. He read the whole thing. The 426-page report, which was published in March of 1968, sold 2 million copies. People were reading it. It earned a spot on the nonfiction bestseller list of the New York Times, but it all disappeared because Lyndon Johnson had a fit. See, Lyndon Johnson read it and said, hey, wait a minute. What about me? What happened to me? It's all about me, right? Yeah, because, you know, I did get the Civil Rights Act passed in 1965 and the Voters Act of 1965, that was me too. Where am I? The commission hadn't given him enough credit for past civil rights legislation. And Johnson said, well, you know what? You're not going to do this. I'm taking my ball and bat and going home. He refused to support further research and never met with any of the commissioners, whether it was Kernan or Lindsay or anybody else, in what would be his final year as president, 1968. National Organization for Women had started in 1966. Betty Friedan, who lived up in Rockland County in New York, wrote The Feminine Mystique and talked about how being a housewife was empty for her and was empty for her colleagues from Smith College, who graduated in 1942. And she started interviewing them in 1957 and found that each one of them felt that they gave up something because they never became professionals. The Feminine Mystique comes out in 1963. The National Organization of Women starts in 1966. And here is their 1967 platform. Have an Equal Rights Amendment. Enforce prohibitions against sex discrimination in employment, also in education. Maternal leave rights in employment and in Social Security benefits. Have tax deductions for home and child care expenses for working parents. Child daycare centers. Equal and non-gender segregated education. When the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, it left a huge loophole in there. Women in education. Women did not get equal rights in higher education because of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And these women were protesting against that. Equal job training opportunities, allowances for women in poverty, and the right for women to control their reproductive lives. Take a close look at that picture. That is assault. That is assault Jake Stemple is trying to commit on Catherine Switzer. And Switzer's boyfriend, the guy on the right side of the picture to her left, big, tall, muscular guy, take a look at those legs, is about ready to intervene. See, Catherine Switzer was going to be in the Boston Marathon in 1967. She grew up as the daughter of a major in the United States Army. This is 1966, so failure was never really an option for her. She's at Syracuse University, and she tells one of her coaches in 1966, I'm training for the Boston Marathon. He says to her, you're a fragile woman. You can't run 26 miles. Can't run 26.2 miles. So she decides, you know what, I'm going to enter it anyway as Kay Switzer. She didn't have her first name, just entered it, Kay Switzer. She trains in secret and enters the race. And the marathon officials are not too thrilled that she's in the race. And take a look at Jock Stemple. He is to her right, trying to push her, and there's her boyfriend who's going to knock Stemple to the ground. Now, knocking her to the ground on cement, what if she hits her head? What if she gets all bruises or a concussion? That is assault. That is attempted assault. People who work for the marathon physically tried to pull her out of the race. Semple tried to remove her from the race by pushing her. Her boyfriend comes over. He was 235 pounds. He was a nationally ranked hammer thrower who was also running the race, sort of as a bodyguard, and pushes Semple to the ground. She does win, or she doesn't win, but she finishes the race 4 hours and 20 minutes. She was not a frail, delicate thing. She ran the race. And in the late 1960s, you heard the refrain from people, women, weaker sex, and I never understood that because women outlive men. Explain how they could be weaker and yet outlive men. Anyway, dainty, fragile, that weaker sex, that was applied to women back in the 1940s, 50s, 60s. Meanwhile, in Greece, there's a military junta that takes over. April 21st, the Greek coup was a culmination of 30 years of national division between the forces of right and left that can be traced to the time of the resistance against the Axis countries, Italy and Germany, and the occupation of Greece during World War II. After liberation, there was a civil war in Greece fought by communist forces, and now the return of people backing the now returned government in exile, and people didn't like them very quickly. And there were posters like that, guilty, Greek military junta, long live democratic Greece. And these guys, torture, repression, murder, they only lasted about 7 years. There was a significant limitation on individuals' rights, free elections suspended, illegal to strike, demonstrate, talk against the government, and to congregate for any purpose except for church. The regime would fall in 1974. The war that people don't talk about is the war in Nigeria between, or actually the Nigerian Civil War between the breakaway areas in the south, Biafra, and Nigeria. The Republic of Biafra started on May 30th, 1967, made up of the states in the eastern region of Nigeria. And for those of you of a certain age, like me, going to be 65, I remember those commercials when I was a kid on TV, the care commercials, send money to us and we'll get it to starving children in Biafra. And there are the Biafrans. The Nigerian Civil War starts July 6, 1967. Biafra represented what were the nationalist aspirations of the Biafran people. They felt they could no longer coexist with the Nigerians. Nigeria was a rather new country by this point. And remember, Africa, the decolonization, which really picked up speed in 1960 when 18 countries became independent, mostly French territories. Africa is trying to figure out what they're doing in the 1960s, and Nigeria just one of those places. Assassinations in Nigeria, government coups, takeovers, and this is just the latest going on in Nigeria at that point. Biafra, formerly recognized by Gabon, Haiti, Ivory Coast, Tanzania, and Zambia. Nations that supplied assistance to Biafra included Israel, France, Spain, Portugal, Norway, Rhodesia, South Africa, and Vatican City. Two countries not on that list, the United States, Lyndon Johnson, and the Brits. The Brits not on their list because the Brits supplied troops and help to Nigeria. By 1968, Nigerian troops surrounded Biafra. They captured the coastal oil facilities in the city of Port Harcourt. The blockade led to mass starvation. There were 3.5 years of war, actually, 2.5 years left after that, ended in 1970. There were 100,000 overall military casualties, 500,000 to 2 million Biafran civilians died of starvation. That's the flag of Biafra. The British forces surrendered, or the Biafran forces surrendered to the Nigerian federal government in January of 1970. This is the Loving couple. The Lovings, that's Mildred Jeter and Loving. They got married in Washington in the late 1950s and decided they wanted to move back to Virginia. Richard Loving, Mildred Jeter, interracial couple. The Supreme Court heard arguments in the Loving versus Virginia case in April of 1967. They were arrested because they got married, and they were an interracial couple, and that was illegal in Virginia. They go back to Virginia. They're charged with breaking the state law which banned interracial marriage and were jailed. The Loving sued the state of Virginia, argued the ban violated the 14th Amendment and was unconstitutional. The Supreme Court ruled by 6-3 decision in June of 1967, bans on interracial marriage were unconstitutional and based on racial discrimination. The decision made interracial marriage legal throughout the United States, and about 6 months later, this movie came out, To Sir with Love. Sidney Poitier there. Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? I'm sorry, it's Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. Sir with Love was a song in the movie by Lulu. Guess Who's Coming to Dinner was one of the few films at the time to depict an interracial marriage in a positive light. It had been illegal, interracial marriage, in most of the United States, and was still illegal in 17 states, mostly southern states, until June 12th, 1967, 6 months before that film was released. Kill! Kill! I want to kill! Oh no, that's Arlo Guthrie. Well, Guthrie comes up in a couple minutes. The first on-campus demonstration against the war is at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. And it wasn't against the war. It was against Dow Chemical because they were trying to recruit future scientists to the company. and they made napalm, a flammable gel that burned its victims. So UW-Madison students in February of 1967, they protested against Dow Chemical. There would be an anti-war protest. This would be an anti-war protest and against Dow. October 17th, 18th, 1967, there was going to be a large anti-war demonstration in Washington a couple of days later. On October 18th, those protests at the University of Wisconsin-Madison became violent, and the TV cameras were there. Cronkite had a crew there. Huntley Brinkley had a crew there. Howard K. Smith had a crew there, and that changes opinions when things like this are shown. Chokeholds, using a baton against an unarmed demonstrator. The protest made national news. University of Wisconsin-Madison was at the forefront of the anti-war movement. It was the start of student demonstrations. This is outside the Pentagon, across the Potomac from Washington, D.C. U.S. troops used rifles in an encounter with anti-war demonstrators, all of whom had no weapons, outside the Pentagon. It's not in Washington, D.C., it's in Arlington, and it should say outside Washington, D.C. It's just across the river, just across the Potomac. You could walk across it and get there. October 21st, 1967. Well, somebody in Massachusetts is getting really, really upset with what's going on with all these anti-war demonstrations. So this 19-year-old high school student says, you know what, I've had enough. We have to love our troops. 25,000 people attended a mass rally in support of American troops in Vietnam, Wakefield, Massachusetts. It was a 19-year-old by the name of Paul Christopher who became tired of the anti-Vietnam War demonstration, so he was going to have a pro-war demonstration. Meanwhile, the folkies are out there. They're singing songs like Bob Dylan, Blowing in the Wind, and Phil Oakes, What Are You Fighting For? And Barry McGuire, Eve of Destruction, and Phil Oakes, again, I Ain't Marching Anymore, and Tom Paxson. Lyndon Told the Nation. They're anti-war. There is a pro-war song. This guy's on Ed Sullivan in 1966. Staff Sergeant Barry Sadler, The Ballad of the Green Berets. He's on January 30th, 66 on the Sullivan Show. And he writes this song in honor of James Gabriel, who is a Hawaiian Green Beret member who was executed by the Viet Cong on January 30th, in 1965 rather, and on January 30th, 66. He's on the Sullivan Show. He's got a bestseller, 2 million copies sold in the first 5 weeks. And you can see the divisions. The pro-war people, anti-war people are hardening. Meanwhile, up at the Guthrie Center, up in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, Ellis's Restaurant comes out in 1967. And this is a picture from about 3 years ago. And I'm hoping this summer I could go up there and even not wear a mask when I do my stuff at the Berkshires. I do speak at the Berkshires, but it's been on Zoom. So I'm hoping, I'm not holding out that much hope, but I'm hoping that I could do something live when I go up to the Berkshires this summer, but I don't have that much hope. In fact, I don't have hope to get the shot till probably June. So more than likely, I'm not going to get this shot in time and be healthy enough to actually speak before a group in Massachusetts. Arlo Guthrie in 1965 is arrested and convicted of dumping trash illegally in Great Barrington, which later leads him to being rejected by the draft board due to his criminal record of littering. It becomes a 17-minute record. It becomes a movie in 1969. That is a picture of the roof at the Guthrie Center. And the Berkshire Eagle down in Great Barrington on Main Street in Great Barrington. That is where the Guthrie story starts, at least nationally. The incident reported, the Berkshire Eagle, November 29, 1965, describes the conviction of Richard J. Robbins and Arlo Guthrie, both of the Bronx. That's where Arlo was living at that time, for illegally disposing of rubbish and a $25 fine each in an order to remove the rubbish. The arresting officer was Stockbridge Police Chief William J. Obahan, Officer Obi. The trial was presided over by Special Judge James E. Hannon. It identifies the incriminating evidence as an envelope addressed to a male resident of Great Barrington, presumably Ray Brock, rather than Guthrie. And I was up there in 2017, the 50th anniversary of the song, Alice's Restaurant. Guthrie explained the song, well, there are just wars and there are non-just wars. And he said this really wasn't an anti-Vietnam song per se. He was arrested for littering. He was thrown in with hardened criminals, which you could hear in the song, and he thought it was stupid. Now, whether he would have gone to Vietnam or not, it's another story, considering Woody Guthrie was his father. But he says it was an anti-stupidity song, not really an anti-war song, but there are other songs. This song came out in 1967. Dionne Warwick, this is not a pro-war song, this is not an anti-war song. This is a song that Hal David, the writer of the song, is imagining about a woman worrying about her man, whether it's a boyfriend or a husband, being in Vietnam. And Hal David is trying to convey a woman's concern for her man with the song, I Say a Little Prayer. It's recorded in 1966, actually, by Dionne Warwick, but Burt Bacharach, who does the music for the song, doesn't like Dionne Warwick's performance, doesn't like it at all. They do 10 takes on Say a Little Prayer, and he still disliked it after the 10th take. It would come out, and he still doesn't like it. It would take over a year and a half to put it out. He always felt there was something wrong with it, but it did come out. Say a Little Prayer is about another view of Vietnam. Meanwhile, Twiggy is the big sensation. She's the Beatlemania of 1967. She arrives at Kennedy Airport, and there are people there. The New Yorker magazine is there, Life magazine, they're snapping pictures. Newsweek reports on the Twiggy phenomenon. The New Yorker magazine, 100 pages about Twiggy, about a model named Twiggy, Leslie Hornby. She became an international sensation, modeling in France, Japan, and America. Unlike the Beatles, she's just a footnote. The Beatles are still selling records, appealing to a new generation now, 51 years after they broke up. My favorite movie of all time is Mel Brooks's The Producers. It's a cult classic, and I normally wouldn't throw it into any talk, except I want to show you how smart Mel Brooks is and how literate Mel Brooks is. The Producers is a satirical comedy written and directed by Melvin Kaminsky. Brooks won an Academy Award for Best Original Screenplay, although I knew some of those people growing up that are in that movie. They're in my family. Decades later, the film was selected for preservation in the National Film Registry and placed 11th on the AFI's 100 Years, 100 Laughs list. Now, you have heard the term creative accounting. Creative accounting was never used until Mel Brooks coined it for the movie. And Mel Brooks was an unknown in 1967. Yeah, he did The 2,000-Year-Old Man with Carl Reiner, but he really wasn't all that known. He never did a movie before, never did a movie. Anyway, it's coined for the 1967 movie. Max Bialystock. This is where they're coming up, where Bialystock is thinking about, hey, I could defraud people and put on a play, close it in one night, and skip out to Rio with the money. You keep saying that because Leo Bloom's saying, hey, you know, you could actually make more money with a flop than a hit. You keep saying that, but you don't tell me how. How could a producer make more money with a flop than a hit? It's a simple matter of creative accounting. Let us assume just for a moment that you're a dishonest man. And I could repeat the dialogue, but we're running out of time. Assume away, move a couple decimal points. Hey, you know what? Take a look at that and take a look at this. See that? That's mine today. But in 1967, you could have had one of those. Of course, didn't have the computer aspect to it, but you could see the other person speaking on the phone. It wasn't FaceTime. The multi-channel video phone was invented and installed by the Nippon Electric Company in Japan. $1,300 US for a one-channel setup. You could see them. They couldn't necessarily see you, but in those days, they were talking about video phones, and that was the first one. Chess Against a Man, that is up in Boston, Massachusetts. Robert Q, a computer program to play chess, was beaten in its first competition with a human in the monthly Boylston Chess Club tournament up in Boston. The computer was at MIT over across the Charles River in Cambridge. Carl Wagner, the opponent, made his moves at the YMCU, which was several miles away in Boston. I love this. The moves were relayed by the old-fashioned way. Teletype. Teletype. No telephone, teletype. Expo 67 Montreal opened up. That was me in 1982 up there. Come on, come all to Expo 67 Montreal. The most successful World's Fair of the 20th century. It ran from April through October, celebrated Canada's 100th anniversary as a nation. I have not gotten back to this place in Charlottetown, PEI, because 2 years ago, or 2019, when I was supposed to be there, we were wiped out by a torrential windstorm, so we couldn't dock in PEI. And last year I was supposed to go up there, and of course it was COVID. So I'm sure they finished Confederate Hall, but I haven't seen it yet. Anyway, Charles de Gaulle, the French guy from France, General de Gaulle, the Premier of France, President of France, makes a big mistake. He's in Montreal. He's going to Expo 67 Montreal, and he says, "Long live free Quebec." That was July 24th, 1967, and he gave voice to the independence movement in Quebec, and that kind of got him in the hot water with Lester B. Pearson, the Prime Minister of Canada, who's now an airport in Toronto, Pearson Airport. Go there, you gotta go through 2 sets of security if you're an American. Anyway, he's saying, he shouts, "Viva le Quebec Libre" to the crowd, gives an international voice to the sovereignist movement, make Quebec an independent country. Pearson denounces de Gaulle's statement as statements unacceptable to the Canadian people. De Gaulle never does get to Expo 67. And finally, something you might have done. The 20th century limited passenger train of the New York Central System makes its final run in Chicago in December 4th, 1967. It began its run between New York and Chicago in 1902. Medical, December 3rd, 1967, Dr. Christian Barnard transplanted the heart of an accident victim, Denise Darvell, into the chest of a 54-year-old man in South Africa, Louis Washkansky. Washkansky regained full consciousness and was easily talking with his wife, but would die 18 days later of pneumonia. And there is Dr. Barnard. And the year ends, and there are 2 soldiers in Vietnam with their little Christmas tree, hoping, just hoping, to get out of there one day. 1967 would end, but 1968 would bring on other problems, problems that would not be resolved in 1968 in Vietnam. Thank you, Allison, for inviting me. Thank you all for being quiet. If you have any questions or comments, let me know.
Evan,
or complaint.
Amazing summer of touching upon what's happening around the world. That in 67, I was 10, and I heard about Biafra because my parents had used that as an example about eating all your food.
Eating all your food to get to Vietnam?
Right. No, about Biafra.
Oh,
Eat
Biafra,
all your food. Yeah. And we would sit there and just mouth off and say, well, then why don't you send it to them? You know, we had no clue.
Yeah.
So when you look back, and of course through high school, college, learning about this, but you tied it in. So you figure, how short is summer or going into the fall? How much has happened? And it continues to happen, but we are a little bit isolated, even though with communication, we read, I mean, everything is linked, but you still, I mean, to hear the details, it's unfathomable what really happened.
The thing that, yes, Diane, the more things change, the more they remain the same.
Yeah.
Thing, you know, is that Kerner Commission report. And if you just take that at face and just break it down into the six areas that thank you, Stephen. This is going to be, this will be on video, so you'll be able to see it. I'll give it to Allison, and Allison will send the link out to you, and look at the PowerPoint. It takes me about 6 hours to put together one of these things, and I do it not from an academic viewpoint, because I'm not an academic. I basically told you my background with John Lindsay, and that was by dumb luck. John just happened to, could have been somebody else, but he just happened to tell me he was running for senator, and it got me on WNEW. And you know, I in New Jersey, I wrote for the Bergen Record 3 separate times. We, you know, when I put something like this together, I'm a journalist. That's what I do. And I just take a look at it. I was talking to a friend of mine who's won 2 Emmys and 7 ACE Awards as well, who was on the other side of the camera. He was he won it for, you know, camera stuff, other side of the camera. And we're just talking, and I said, you know, I'll look at the topic, and okay, bang, 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 bang. And if I was doing a documentary, and I was the executive producer of a documentary, and we were doing this on film, I would lay it out and tell the people working for me, well, this is what I want, that's what I want, that's what I want. These are the bullet points, and just flesh it out, which is what Ken Burns does. And so I've, with me and doing all this, I put together, I was telling Allison, a 1960 talk yesterday. It took me 3 days to do it. And I just, you know, I'll just do it. And then you get involved in it, and you start reading, and you start, well, I was 4 years old in 1960, I was 3 and 4. And I remember the story about Nikita Khrushchev allegedly banging his shoe at the United Nations, which never happened. Pounded his fist, didn't bang his shoe, although he had a shoe in his hand. And I'm looking at things, and I said, I'm looking, oh, 1960, the Playboy Club opened up. Well, as a kid of the 1960s, and men probably won't discuss this with him, but I remember Hugh Hefner. I remember getting Playboys and sneaking it under my bed. I remember one day I was going to go to the Playboy Club, which I never did because they were literally out of business by the time I was ready to go to those places. And oh, by the way, the pill started in 1960. So, hey, listen, 1960, you got the pill, you got Hefner, you got Elvis coming back, you got Cassius Clay winning a gold medal at the Olympics, and the Beatles changing their name. That's the entire scope of my childhood into my adulthood. So a lot of these things you put together, and they still resonate all these years later, and that's how I approach it. Any questions or comments before I get on out of here?
I do. I'm sorry, anybody else jump in front of me, but the Kerner report and the people that were working on it, they didn't have any real representation of any of the other cities except, I believe, what was it, Milwaukee? But there was no representation from Detroit, Newark. So kind of interesting.
They figured John Lindsay could take care of that. Because yeah. Lindsay was
your buddy John Lindsay.
Yeah. So
Mayor of New York, right.
Mayor Lindsay, who I remember. I don't owe my career to him, but
oh, I know you
certainly helped propel it when you're 21 years old, which I was in 1978. So I can't believe, sometimes I look back, I was hanging around Mario Cuomo and Hugh Carey and Jack Kemp, and interviewed Ronald Reagan when I was 23. So sometimes I wonder, that had to be somebody else, but it was me. You know, my wife's cousin says you put yourself in that position to be there. So, but news was totally different in those days.
I don't know if you saw this other comment about, was there any post-1967 book or movie that you saw that surprised or shocked you?
No. No, because I kind of live with those people in the 70s and 80s. So, I was, covering those people for about 4 or 5 years. So no, no. In fact, Nixon, I met Nixon in '85, and I had I wouldn't say a relationship with him, but I would see him a lot. And Larry O'Brien was the commissioner of the National Basketball Association, did sports. And, you know, O'Brien was the target of Nixon at the Democratic National headquarters at Watergate in 1972. And I say to people, I was 16 at the time. How did I intersect with those people? It's just mind-boggling to me, but I have stories about them. And what I do is I videotape all this, and I'm going to give it to my grandkids. So when they're old enough, they'll say, hey, you know, Grandpa really actually
did something. Now I'm only kidding.
I didn't do anything. I just happened to be at the right place at the right time. So,
does anybody else have any other comments? Because this was a really good trip back to a very volatile couple of months.
Wait, we got 1968 coming up.
That's coming up this Thursday. If you haven't received the link, if you're not on my email distribution list, please connect with me. I'd be happy to send you about the year of 1968 women's lib movement.
Well, that's part of it, but Atlantic City takes a major role in that in 1968. I'll leave it at that. You got to have a keeper, and we'll leave it at that.
Anybody else? I'm sorry, go ahead, Mariel, sorry.
I lived in the Berkshires, and I was so happy to see you talk about the Berkshires and all the beautiful photographs up there.
Yeah, it's really a picturesque place. I speak every year at the Pittsfield UJF there. And other places, and it's, you know, it's really, yeah, I stay there for a few days because my wife's cousin has a place up there. So it's, you know, I've gone to Lee and North Adams and all those other places up there, which are really, really nice. And
it's nice. I used to live next to Pittstown for a couple of years.
Yeah. Pittsfield.
Pittsfield. Oh, Pittsfield.
Pittsfield.
Yeah. Pittstown is New Jersey.
But you can't use the Housatonic River, right? Because GE threw all those chemicals in there, so it's a dead river.
But it's just a shame.
Yeah, so beautiful.
It was.
The reason I had asked the question about the book or the movie was I was out of the country for both the times of the '68 conventions.
Yeah.
And I couldn't understand when I got back. I was a teenager, and I couldn't understand all of the controversy when I got back. And I suddenly came across the movie by Hexel Waxler called Medium Cool, which was the film, the docu film about the Chicago Convention.
Yeah.
And it was one of the few things I had seen that really emblazoned real-time events with a background story that sort of made a lot of sense. So it kind of revealed a lot of things that I hadn't been fully aware of before. That's why I was saying a book or a movie that kind of, because films tend to, you know, either celebrate or bring out moments 2 or 3 or 5 years after the events themselves.
Well, you know, now it's coming up to 3 years. In March of 2018, I was on a cruise, speaking on a cruise in the Caribbean. I was doing the 1968 talk. I'm not going to give too much away on this because I'm doing the 68 talk, but on the cruise, there were about 5 or 6 people from Chicago from that time. And I'll tell more about it when we do the 68 talk, but there was one woman who said that she was on top of the Hilton Hotel. She didn't tell me why she was there, but she was on top of the Hilton Hotel and she was looking down. And she said that you could see the police and you could see the protesters. And she said the police were looking to get at those protesters. And when I did the 68 talk, I'll talk about the reviews the police got in a very conservative Chicago Tribune, which might surprise you about what they said about Dick Daley and the Chicago police in 1968. You know, when I do give these talks, these talks, when I'm in person, sometimes I'll get an education from the people who are sitting and listening to this. And again, like I said, in this talk, this woman said to me, you keep talking about the boys in Vietnam, the troops. Some of those troops were women. And she was right. And I will adjust to what I hear from people who are older than me, who were either in the streets. There was one woman when I do the 69 or 70 talk, I guess it was 69 because I did the 92nd Street Y. And I was talking about Ali, and she said the highlight of her protesting career was Muhammad Ali being 6 feet away from her in a protest in Manhattan. What's the highlight of her protesting career?
Also, I want to say that To Sir With Love, that song that you had mentioned, actually was in the movie To Sir With Love. I don't believe it was during.
I'll check that out.
Yeah.
That out. But
So I just saw that movie, and it just kind of makes you cringe. It's just eye-opening. That's all I can say.
Yeah. So,
But I know you're probably zooming off here, and I just wanted to say, Evan, I just love your talks, and I'm glad everybody that participated, even passively, just to intake what the heck happened, because, you know, as history goes on, we got to forget some of the information. So this was a very good summation of the highlights of what happened that summer. I like it. The summer I was 10.
I was
And
10.
fall,
I was
thank
11.
you.
I was 11. Anyway, thank everybody.
You.
We will see you on Thursday. 68, just a continuation of 67.
I appreciate it.
And you know, people talk about 68 being the most destructive year of the decade. And yeah, you had the assassinations, but 69 is actually the most destructive year of the decade when you look back in retrospect, because in 1 month you get Golda Meir, Yasser Arafat, Assad, all within 3 weeks taking over what their constituencies, and you throw in Nixon as well at that point, and you look at that and you just say, wow, that was quite the 3 or 4 weeks. That was in January, February 1969. What happened then? And it has a tremendous impact on history. But anyway, I will let you go. Thank you, Allison, for inviting me.
Oh, my pleasure. It's always a great invite. Thank you, and everybody else participating. Great to see everybody, and thanks for joining me. Evan, thank you. Enjoy the day. I'll see everybody on Thursday again.
Okay, take care then.